I was sitting alone in our cozy home in Austin, flipping through old family photos, tracing the memories that now felt like pieces of a different life. Pictures of us laughing together on vacations, birthdays, school events. It felt like just yesterday that we were a happy family. The warmth of those moments faded as I heard voices drifting in from the other room. It was my son, Luke, talking quietly with someone. Curiosity pulled me closer, but as I reached the doorway, I froze. There, in our living room, stood Linda, Mike's mistress, the woman who had replaced me in so many ways. And my son was confiding in her, his words clear as day. "Sometimes I wish you were my mom," Luke said, his voice soft but unmistakable. My heart stopped. I gripped the door frame, feeling as if the floor was giving way beneath me. How did we get here? How did my son, the child I had loved and raised, whose scraped knees I'd kissed and bedtime stories I'd read, come to wish for another woman to replace me? Linda put a comforting hand on his shoulder, glancing toward the hallway where I stood hidden. Her presence, once a shadow lurking in my marriage, had now seeped into my role as a mother. As the gravity of Luke's words sank in, my hands shook, and a wave of pain washed over me. In that moment, I knew this betrayal was more than just my husband's. It was deeper. It had spread, affecting even the bond between me and my son. I straightened up, swallowing the grief rising in my throat. I couldn't stay silent any longer. It was time to confront them both, and no matter how painful, I was ready to face the truth head on. It wasn't long ago that our life felt almost like a dream. Living in a comfortable suburban neighborhood in Austin, our days were filled with warmth, laughter, and a sense of stability that I believed would last forever. I'd built a life with Mike, my high school sweetheart, who had always been the one I thought I'd grow old with. We'd met young and grown together, and though our journey hadn't been without its bumps, we had created a beautiful life, one I was proud of. Luke, our only child, was the center of it all. He was the sweetest, most caring boy, with an infectious laugh that could light up any room. Mike adored him too, and I would often catch him and Luke in the middle of some secret father-son joke that would leave them giggling for minutes on end. I treasured those moments, seeing the two people I loved most in the world sharing that special bond. I often told myself how lucky I was to have this family. Our weekends were filled with soccer games, backyard barbecues, and movie nights where we'd all pile onto the couch together. Even weeknights had their charm, cooking dinner as Luke chattered about his day at school, or Mike sneaking a playful kiss when he thought Luke wasn't looking. I cherished those moments, feeling as though I had everything I'd ever wanted. But there were cracks I hadn't noticed back then, or maybe I just chose not to see them. Mike had started taking more work trips, often coming home late and looking worn down. He'd explain his absence as work stress, and I believed him. I'd remind myself that he was working hard for our family, to give us this life. And when he was distant, I'd brush it off, convincing myself it was just part of life, of marriage, of being an adult. Looking back, I can see it clearly, the moments when his phone would buzz, and he'd step outside to take the call, or the weekends he'd say he needed to catch up on work alone in his study. Back then, I'd think, maybe he just needs space. Maybe it's just work. I didn't want to pry or make him feel uncomfortable, so I gave him his privacy, trusting him without question. Luke and I would make the best of those days when Mike was away. We'd go to the park or have ice cream dates, laughing together as he told me about the things he was learning in school. I never thought much of it, never saw anything unusual, just a father working hard for his family, and a mother filling in the gaps. But now, looking back, I can see the subtle signs, the moments that should have sparked suspicion. The whispered phone calls, the way he'd pull away when I reached out to him in bed, the hints that I'd trained myself to ignore. I had invested everything into our family, my love, my trust, my loyalty, all without questioning that Mike would do the same. As I sat there, reminiscing about those moments, I felt an ache deep inside, a bitter twist of regret for having been so blind, so trusting. I had poured my heart into creating a happy home, a safe space for us all, never imagining that Mike had been slipping away from me, piece by piece, moment by moment. I could almost hear my own voice, urging myself to look closer, to ask questions I'd been too afraid to ask. But back then, it was easier to ignore the warning signs than to admit that something might be wrong. And as I brought myself back to the present, I realized how naive I'd been, how much I'd allowed myself to believe in a perfect picture that had always had cracks in it. I'd put everything into building this family, never suspecting that a betrayal was lurking just around the corner, waiting to shatter everything I thought was real. The house was unusually quiet. Luke was out with friends, and Mike was supposed to be working late. I was straightening up in our bedroom when I noticed Mike's phone, left carelessly on the bedside table, screen faintly glowing. Normally, I wouldn't think twice about his phone. We'd never needed to hide things from each other, or so I'd believed. But something inside me, a gut feeling I couldn't ignore, made me reach for it. I held my breath, feeling a pang of guilt for snooping as I unlocked his phone. But as soon as I did, I saw it, a message from someone named Linda. My hands began to tremble as I clicked on the text thread. The messages were flirtatious, intimate. They weren't the kind of messages shared between colleagues or casual friends. I read on, feeling my chest tighten as the messages grew bolder, more affectionate, talking about things they'd done together, plans they had. The one that made my heart shatter simply read, "Can't wait to see you again, love." Last night was unforgettable. I closed the messages, staring blankly at the wall as the reality hit me like a wave. All the excuses, the late nights, the business trips, they all made sense now. He hadn't been working late or stressed from work. He'd been with her, Linda. The name burned into my mind, a woman I'd never met but now seemed to know too well. She was the reason behind his distance, the hollow look in his eyes, the coldness that had seeped into our relationship. I couldn't hold back the anger and hurt flooding through me. I felt betrayed, blindsided. After everything I had sacrificed, everything I had given him, this was how he repaid me? I wanted answers, so I waited for him to come home, rehearsing my words, feeling the weight of 1,000 broken promises on my shoulders. When Mike finally walked through the door that evening, he looked tired, but I knew better now. I waited until he'd set his bag down and looked up, his eyes meeting mine. He must have sensed something was wrong, because he hesitated, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "I saw your phone," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but it was enough. The color drained from his face as he processed my words. "You looked through my phone?" he stammered, trying to regain composure. "Don't turn this around on me, Mike," I snapped, fury and heartbreak lacing my words. "You lied to me. All those late nights, those business trips. You were with her, weren't you? With Linda?" He looked away, shame and guilt etched into his face. It just happened," he mumbled, as if that could explain away the devastation he'd caused. "It wasn't planned. We started talking, and things got complicated." "Complicated?" My voice broke, disbelief mingling with the pain. "You lied to me, to our family. You betrayed everything we built together, and you call it complicated?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair, still unable to look at me. "I never wanted to hurt you. I don't even know how it started. It just happened." I felt a wave of anger rise, struggling to keep my voice steady. "You don't know how it started?" I repeated, my voice dripping with disbelief. "You chose this. You chose her over us, over our family, over everything we shared." The words hung heavy between us, and I could see a flicker of guilt flash in his eyes, but he quickly masked it, almost as if he couldn't fully face the reality of what he'd done. "Look, we can work this out. Linda doesn't mean anything, not in the way you do." I scoffed, stepping back as if his words had physically hurt me. "So that's supposed to make it better? That I'm somehow worth more than the woman you betrayed me with?" In that moment, I wanted nothing more than to scream, to let out the rage and sorrow that had been building in me, but I couldn't. All I could do was stare at him, the man I thought I knew, standing there, justifying his betrayal as though it were some minor lapse in judgment. And then, I caught a glimpse of movement behind him. Luke had come home, and he was standing in the doorway, listening. For a moment, I thought he would rush over, would comfort me, stand by my side. But instead, he turned to his father, a look of silent understanding passing between them. It was like a dagger to my heart. I realized then that Luke had seen his father as the one wronged, as if somehow my heartbreak didn't matter as much. The cracks in my relationship with my son deepened, and I felt like an outsider in my own home. I was shattered, feeling the walls of everything I had built slowly collapsing around me. I'd lost my husband to another woman, and worse, I was beginning to lose my son too. The betrayal was more than just infidelity. It was a tearing apart of the very foundation of my family. As I stood there, numb with disbelief and sorrow, I knew that life as I knew it had changed forever. It started with small comments, things I'd usually brush off as typical teenage moods. But this was different. Luke had always been a sweet kid, affectionate, and full of empathy. But ever since I discovered Mike's affair, I began noticing a shift, a coldness, a distance I couldn't explain. Each time I tried to talk to him, he would barely look up, his responses curt, his voice lined with an edge I hadn't heard before. One evening, as I passed by Mike's study, I heard voices coming from inside. I slowed my steps, recognizing the unmistakable sound of Luke's voice. She's different from Mom, you know? He was saying, his tone casual but pointed. She's fun. She doesn't get mad about little things. It's like, she just understands. I froze, feeling a pang of hurt shoot through me. Linda. Fun. A woman who had been a shadow in my marriage, now a comparison to me? My son's words cut deeper than any insult. When had I become the bad guy? I listened as Mike chuckled softly, as if to agree with him. Yeah, buddy, she's pretty great, isn't she? The knot in my stomach grew tighter. There it was, the confirmation I didn't want to believe, that my son was being drawn toward Linda, subtly coaxed by the man who should have been protecting me, protecting our family bond. The next few days felt like watching a stranger in my own home. I would see Luke laughing on the phone, speaking to Linda like they were the best of friends, or talking about her around the house as if she were some amazing influence in his life. Every time I tried to bring him back to our reality, he would brush me off, his gaze filled with a cool indifference I had never seen before. One evening, we sat at the dinner table in silence, the air thick with unspoken words. Luke looked up and said almost casually, "You know, Linda said we should go hiking sometime. She thinks it'd be good for Dad and me to get out together." I swallowed, feeling the bitterness rise within me. "Does she?" I replied, my voice barely steady. "Yeah," he said, eyes bright with excitement. "She really cares about us. She even said she could show me some things in her field, you know, for my school project." I could only stare, my mind reeling. This woman, who'd torn my life apart, was now embedding herself into my son's life, taking a role I'd always cherished. Luke's admiration for her was like a knife twisting in my heart. As the days went on, I saw less of the child I'd raised, and more of a stranger influenced by his father's betrayal. He would dismiss me with barely a glance, and sometimes I'd overhear him talking to his friends, comparing Linda's easygoing nature with my supposed overbearing presence. Every word stung, a reminder of how easily my role was being erased. Then came the night that broke me. Luke had come home late after spending the evening with Mike and Linda. He barely acknowledged me as he walked in, his face alight with enthusiasm. I asked him how his evening was, hoping for a chance to reconnect, but he brushed me off. "Mom, can we not do this right now?" he said, sounding exasperated. "Linda already gave me the talk about respecting personal space. I wish you were more like her sometimes." His words were a slap across my face. How had this happened? When had my own child come to see me as the enemy, to view another woman, the woman who'd destroyed our family, as a role model? I spent that night alone in my room, replaying every memory I had of Luke's laughter, his hugs, his love. I couldn't reconcile the boy who used to cling to my hand with the teenager who now idolized a woman who had no right to hold such a place in his heart. As the realization sank in, a painful clarity washed over me. I was no longer welcome in my own family. The love I had given freely, the sacrifices I had made, now felt hollow in the face of the indifference from both my husband and son. A part of me wanted to fight, to reclaim my place, to remind Luke of everything we'd shared. But the other part, the part that felt broken beyond repair, was starting to believe that maybe it was time to walk away. I didn't belong here anymore, not in a house where loyalty was forfeit and love was conditional. Sitting in my best friend Sarah's living room, I felt the weight of the last few weeks pressing down on me. She listened quietly, her brow furrowed, as I poured out everything: Mike's betrayal, Linda's growing presence, and the heart-wrenching shift in Luke. I'd tried to rationalize staying, to keep my family together for Luke's sake, but every day had become another reminder that I was no longer part of the life I'd built. Sarah reached over, squeezing my hand. "You can't keep doing this to yourself. This isn't fair to you. Luke will understand one day, but right now, he's too influenced by Mike." I nodded, feeling a tear slip down my cheek. "I know, but he's my son. How can I just leave? What kind of mother does that make me?" Sarah's face softened. "A mother who knows her worth. Staying in a place where you're treated like this, by Mike, by Luke, it's not healthy for you, and it's not a good example for him either. He needs to see that you're strong enough to walk away from people who don't value you." Her words settled over me, a painful truth I could no longer ignore. Each hurtful comment from Luke, every dismissive look, every moment he favored Linda over me. It was as if he was peeling away at my heart, layer by layer. I couldn't remember the last time he'd shown me the love we once shared, the bond that had once seemed unbreakable. I sat in silence, staring out the window. I'd built my life around being a mother, believing that love could conquer any betrayal, but I couldn't ignore the damage it was doing to my own spirit. My mind kept replaying the same moment, Luke's voice cutting through me like a blade. "I wish you were more like her, Mom." I thought about all the times I had tried to reach out to him, hoping he'd see through the manipulation, that he'd remember the years we'd spent together before Linda came into the picture. But each attempt was met with apathy, or, worse, annoyance. Returning home that night, I was numb, a hollow shell of the person I once was. I could feel the decision solidifying within me, even as my heart screamed against it. I had to leave. For myself, for the person I used to be, the one who still deserved respect and love. The next morning, I sat Mike down. My voice shook, but my words were firm. "I'm leaving, Mike. I can't do this anymore." He looked at me, almost bored, as if I'd told him I was stepping out for a quick errand. "If that's what you want," he said with a shrug, barely glancing up from his phone. The indifference stung, but it wasn't unexpected. I turned to find Luke, hoping for at least a flicker of understanding, a sign that he'd miss me, that this meant something to him. He looked up, his expression eager. "So, does this mean Linda can come around more? Stay over?" he asked, his eyes lighting up in a way they hadn't for me in weeks. The final piece of my heart broke. I'd held on to the faint hope that Luke would realize how much I loved him, that he'd see the sacrifice I was making, but his excitement over Linda's presence told me everything I needed to know. I nodded slowly, feeling the emptiness expand within me. "Yes, I suppose it does," I whispered, my voice almost lost in the quiet room. In that moment, I realized the family I had devoted myself to no longer existed. I had become an outsider in my own home, a stranger to my own child. Taking a deep breath, I turned away, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over me. As I closed the door behind me, I couldn't help but wonder if they'd ever realize what they'd lost. But deep down, I knew I couldn't wait for that moment to come. It was time to build a new life for myself, one where my worth wouldn't be questioned or dismissed. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, I felt like I was taking control of my own happiness. The house had grown noticeably quieter without me, but I couldn't say I missed it. I'd created a new rhythm for myself, one rooted in peace and self-respect. But as the months passed, things were shifting in the home I'd left behind, and soon enough, the reality of my absence began to seep into their lives. At first, Linda seemed thrilled to step into the mom role. I imagined she basked in the attention, her chance to play the perfect partner and mother now that I was gone. Luke was just as enthusiastic, almost as if he'd been waiting for her to step in and do it right in all the ways he felt I hadn't. But cracks started forming in that picture-perfect fantasy soon after. Linda was no mother, and the effort she initially put into it began to fade as her patience waned. One day, Linda was supposed to pick Luke up from school, something I had done like clockwork every single day. But that afternoon, as he stood outside waiting, the minutes ticked by with no sign of her. He watched as his classmates were picked up one by one until he was the last one standing, wondering if she'd forgotten him. When she finally showed up, nearly an hour late, she barely apologized, brushing it off with a curt, "Something came up. You're old enough to wait, aren't you?" Luke didn't say much in response, but his disappointment was clear. This wasn't the motherly care he had hoped for, but he swallowed his feelings, convincing himself it was just a one-time thing. Yet, it wasn't. Days turned into weeks, and it became clear that Linda's priorities were more self-centered than motherly. The lunches I used to make with care were replaced with rushed store-bought meals she'd toss in his direction. She'd spend hours scrolling on her phone or texting friends, barely glancing up when Luke tried to talk to her about his day. The little things I had done, listening, being attentive, showing up consistently, were missing. I had always put Luke's needs first, even when it meant setting my own plans aside. But Linda's idea of parenting was far less selfless. If something didn't fit her schedule, it simply didn't happen. One weekend, Luke asked if they could go to the park, something we used to do together often. Linda sighed, barely looking up from her phone. "You're old enough to go by yourself, aren't you?" she replied. "Or you can wait until your dad gets home." Disappointed, Luke retreated to his room, where he found himself looking through the drawer where he kept old family photos. He stumbled upon one of the two of us, a snapshot from one of our park trips. In the photo, I was helping him climb a tree, both of us laughing, my hands outstretched to catch him. A pang of regret twisted in his chest as he remembered how safe he had felt, knowing that no matter what, I would always be there to catch him. Even Mike began to notice the changes. Linda was less and less involved with household matters, leaving him to pick up the slack. She was quick to spend time with her friends, often heading out for hours and leaving Mike and Luke alone, something I rarely did. There was no one to manage the chaos, no one to balance the delicate dynamic that held their lives together. The house itself felt different, messier, colder, empty of the care I had once put into every corner. One evening, Luke overheard Mike and Linda arguing in the kitchen. She was talking about a weekend getaway she wanted to take with her friends, seemingly unconcerned with who would care for Luke in her absence. Her voice was sharp, defensive. "I need my space, Mike. I'm not here to babysit 24/7. I'm not his actual mother." Her words struck Luke like a slap. He had wanted her to be that, had thought she could fill the role I'd left behind, but now he was beginning to see the truth. Linda was a guest in their lives, not a mother. And though she had played the part well at first, the act was fading, and he was left feeling more alone than ever. Pride kept both Mike and Luke from admitting their mistake, from acknowledging the emptiness my absence had created. Yet, they felt it in the silence that filled the house, in the little things they had once taken for granted, The warm meals, the listening ear, the constant presence. As days passed, they grew accustomed to the void, each too stubborn to reach out, but both of them, in their own ways, realized they'd lost something irreplaceable. For Luke, it was the warmth and safety he'd taken for granted, and for Mike, it was the stability of a partner who had truly cared. While neither of them would say it out loud, my absence hung over them like a shadow, a reminder of all they had lost but couldn't bring themselves to admit. The kitchen was quiet, a stark contrast to the warmth and laughter that had once filled it. Mike and Luke sat across from each other, a tense silence settling between them. Dinner was a microwaved meal Linda had quickly put together before rushing out the door, barely saying goodbye. She'd left the house with an easy shrug, like her presence was simply an afterthought. And now, here they were, father and son, staring down at the unappealing food, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Luke poked at his plate, the flicker of disappointment evident in his eyes. "Dad, I miss Mom's cooking," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Mike looked up, caught off guard. "What do you mean, bud? Linda made dinner," he replied, trying to brush off Luke's comment, though he felt a pang of regret somewhere deep inside. "No, Dad. I mean, really miss it. Like the way Mom used to actually care about what we were eating, and she'd ask about our day. She didn't just throw food at us and leave," Luke said, his voice heavy with something Mike hadn't heard from him before. "Hurt." Mike sighed, setting his fork down. He could feel the weight of his choices closing in on him, Luke's disappointment cutting through him like a knife. In those words, he heard all the small moments he'd dismissed, the everyday kindnesses he'd taken for granted. He remembered the meals his wife used to make, each one prepared with care, with an extra dollop of love for her family. It had all felt so normal then, so expected. Now, with only the cold silence to greet him, he realized how much he'd lost. He looked over at Luke, feeling the guilt rise within him. "Luke, I know things have been different," he began, searching for the right words. "I know she's not like your mom." Luke's face hardened. "It's not just that, Dad. Linda doesn't care. I thought she would be fun, that she'd be like, well, someone who'd be around. But she's not. She barely talks to me unless she has to, and she's always going out. It's not the same." The truth in Luke's words hit Mike with full force, and he struggled to keep his emotions in check. The picture-perfect life he'd envisioned with Linda was fading, and in its place, a harsh reality was emerging. He could see now that he'd traded a genuine love for a fantasy, thinking it would fulfill him. But instead, it had left him hollow, realizing too late that what he'd had was more precious than he could have ever understood. Mike leaned back, his voice faltering. "Your mom, she gave so much to us, more than we ever appreciated." He paused, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I was selfish, Luke. I let us both down." Luke stared at his father, his expression a mixture of anger and sadness. "You shouldn't have let her go, Dad. Things were better with her here. I thought Linda would be different, but now I just wish Mom was still here." The quiet between them grew heavier as they both sat with their regret. Mike's mind wandered to memories of his wife, the way she'd smile, her patience with their son, her warmth that made the house feel like a home. It was a warmth Linda couldn't replicate, a part of her that had kept their lives bound together. In that moment, Mike's regret became sharper, a searing realization that he had lost not just a wife, but a true partner and mother for their family. He'd made choices he couldn't undo, but now he was faced with the aftermath, knowing he'd shattered something that had once been beautiful and whole. Do you think she'd ever forgive us?" Luke asked, his voice filled with uncertainty, almost as if he couldn't bring himself to believe it could happen. Mike's gaze dropped to the table, his hands clasped tightly as if holding on to something that was no longer there. "I don't know, Luke, but I hope someday we'll get the chance to make it right." As they sat together, surrounded by the stillness that now defined their home, both father and son shared an unspoken understanding. They had pushed away the one person who had given them everything, and now they didn't know how to bring her back. The sun was setting as I walked toward the familiar bench in the park, a place I had once brought Luke to feed the ducks and enjoy lazy afternoons together. Today, though, it felt like stepping into the past, a life I had let go of but couldn't fully forget. As I neared, I saw them both. Mike, with a somber expression, and Luke, nervously wringing his hands, his eyes scanning the crowd as if unsure he'd actually see me. When I reached them, Luke was the first to stand, looking older and more vulnerable than I remembered. He took a hesitant step toward me, his voice trembling as he spoke. "Mom, I'm sorry. I don't know why I said those things, or why I thought Linda could be like you." Tears glistened in his eyes, and for the first time, I saw the pain and regret in his face. It wasn't the boy who had once idolized Linda speaking now, but my son, who finally understood the impact of his words and actions. I didn't realize how much you did for me," he continued, his voice breaking. "I miss you, Mom. I miss how you always knew what I needed, how you were there even when I didn't deserve it. I'm sorry for everything." The sincerity in his words touched a part of me I had tried to protect, a tenderness that hadn't quite disappeared despite the hurt. I reached out, pulling him into a hug, and as he wrapped his arms around me, I felt a familiar warmth, a piece of my heart coming home. Mike cleared his throat, looking down at the ground as if struggling to find his voice. "I'm sorry too," he said finally, his words heavy with remorse. I thought I could find happiness with Linda, but all I found was emptiness. I know I hurt you deeply, more than I could ever make up for." He looked at me, his eyes filled with regret. "You were everything, and I threw it away for a fantasy that never meant anything. I was selfish, and I lost the best person I'd ever known because of it. I know I can't take it back, but I needed you to know, I'm sorry." The weight of his confession hung in the air, a truth I'd been waiting to hear, but no longer needed for closure. I searched his face, seeing the man I once loved buried beneath the guilt and shame, but I also saw the realization that our life together was no longer a possibility. We'd both changed, and there was no going back. I nodded, my voice steady but kind. "Thank you, Mike. I appreciate the apology, but forgiveness doesn't mean things can go back to the way they were. You made your choices, and so did I. I have found peace, and I intend to keep it." Turning to Luke, I took his hands in mine. "I'll always be here for you, sweetheart, but things will be different. You and I will find our way forward, together, but on my terms." Luke nodded, relief washing over his face as he hugged me again, holding on as if he were afraid to let go. It felt like a small victory, a piece of the love we'd once shared coming back to life, and I knew this was a bond I could rebuild, one that wouldn't need forgiveness but growth. I stepped back, looking at both of them, feeling a strange sense of completion. This is goodbye, Mike. For good. My words were calm, unburdened, the final page of a story I was ready to close. As I turned to leave, I felt lighter, empowered by my choice to walk away and reclaim my life. Luke's apology had given me peace, but it hadn't tethered me to the past. This was my journey now, one I'd walk without bitterness, carrying only the lessons I'd learned. The setting sun cast a warm glow on the path ahead, and I knew, as I walked forward, that I was ready to embrace whatever came next. Free, forgiven, and fully in control of my future.